Hello and welcome. I am so happy that you have joined me here today. We're looking at Nehemiah chapter 4, so grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get started. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. So today we're looking at where Nehemiah's at. He's faced a lot of opposition while we've looked at chapters 2 and chapter 3. And now the people are starting to build the walls of Jerusalem. And we're going to notice how Nehemiah responds to some of the objections that he gets. So in verse 1, Sanballat. So when Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the temple wall, he became angry and he became greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews. So opposition, despite how it feels, is actually good news. It means that we are doing something worthwhile. And the reason that our life feels like it's at war sometimes is because we are doing the kingdom's work. And in fact, we are on the front line of this war. So if you've got a decision to make. Do you want your life to be comfortable or do you want your life to count? So in Nehemiah chapter 4, we see that Nehemiah is faced with the constant opposition. And it's the more that his work is effective, the more intense the pressure is mounted against him. First, the enemy ridiculed him and they tried to discourage him. And then they tried to stir up trouble against Nehemiah. And when that didn't work, they turned up the heat by using intimidation. But Nehemiah was undeterred. He didn't lay down and let the enemies distract him from the task. The devil, he loves to distract the people when we're about the Lord's businesses. So don't fall for this tactic. Be as steadfast as Nehemiah, who prayed to God that he would handle his enemies. So Nehemiah refused to give way to fear. Instead, he trusted God and God's awesome power. So Sanballat, we're introduced to Sanballat again, and this is not the first time that we've read about him and being upset about the walls being rebuilt in Jerusalem. Sanballat and Tobiah were first deeply disturbed that they had heard that a man had wanted to help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. We can see that back in chapter 2, verse 10. And then they used scorn and intimidation to prevent the work from starting. So that was in Nehemiah 2 verses 19. And now the work has begun. They are furious. They are indignant. And they sought to bring discouragement and criticism. But here, Sanballat, his anger, he is greatly incensed and he appears to be getting more and more angry. And the term used here is like a fiery, hot, burning hot anger. So it says that Sanballat, he ridiculed the Jews. Verse 2, he says, and in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore the wall? Will they offer sacrifice? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from the heaps of rubble burned as they are? And then Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what are they rebuilding? Even a fox climbing upon it would break it down, the walls of stones. So Sanballat and Tobiah, they used insults to belittle the workers' effort and to sow doubt among those about the project's feasibility. And I think it's reasonable to assume that they had perceived a threat. Otherwise, they wouldn't have bothered about criticising it. Because Nehemiah and the workers did in fact have legal protection from the king, proven by the letters that Nehemiah had got mentioned in Nehemiah 2 verse 7, Sanballat and Tobiah really had no authority to actually stop the work. All they could do was discourage the Jews into stopping the project. And so their tactic is to discourage the workers by portraying that their work is meaningless and that their work is feeble. And so discouragement really is actually a very powerful weapon because it is somewhat the opposite of faith. So where faith believes that God in his love and his promises, discouragement looks for and it believes the worst. So it tends to be pretty much, it forgets God and what he has promised to do. And discouragement can be a very effective tool that the enemy uses if we are not wise to remind ourselves of what God's truths are and what his promises and covenants are. And so in response to Sanballat and Tobiah, Nehemiah, he didn't debate. He didn't form a committee. He didn't even deal with the enemies directly. Instead, he took it to God in prayer. And there are times when we need to just stop everything and start praying. And so here he prays in verse 4. He says, "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder into the land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in our face of the builders." So he didn't respond or reply to Sanballat or Tobiah directly. He simply prayed about them and asked God to deal with the situation. Nehemiah prays, "Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight." And on the face of it, it appears confusing that Nehemiah could ask God basically not to forgive them. It's sort of what it feels like initially. So you might read this as Nehemiah wanting Sanballat to be damned. But most commentators suggest that the prayers of Nehemiah, he is asking God for justice. He's asking God for justice against his enemies who are actively opposing a righteous cause, the God's cause. And he's asking God not to just overlook or to blot out their sins, but to hold them accountable, asking God to deal with them justly, according to God's justice and according to their actions and their choices. So we rebuild the wall till it had reached half its height, for the people worked with all of their might. We're up to verse 6. So the first half of the walls, they are completed. And they're completed so fast because Nehemiah and the people in Jerusalem, they were motivated, they were enthusiastic, they were determined. And so they've reached the halfway point. Now, Charles Swindoll, he has a comment on this. He says, "Critics demoralise, leaders encourage." And when the critics spoke, the workmen heard them and they were demoralised. But when the capable leader stepped up and said, "Let's look at God's way, stay on the job," the crew members were back in there. So it's not enough just to begin well. Many a sport team has had a great first half only to lose in the final minutes. The rebuilding work has gone very well and many obstacles have been overcome, but the job isn't done yet. The game isn't over and there is still time to fail. Verse 7. "But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs and the Ammonites and all the people of Ashdod heard about the repairs of the walls of Jerusalem had gone ahead and the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet these threats." So as the work progressed, the enemies, they became more serious. Now, they didn't simply just complain or mock. They are threatening. They are planning violence. Verse 9 it talks about, so what does Nehemiah do? Again, Nehemiah prays. And we don't know the length or the content of this prayer, but we do know that he prayed with people. He says, "We prayed to our God." So Nehemiah understood the value of corporate and united prayer. He understood that effective prayers do not belong to him alone. He doesn't have an exclusive right to effective prayer, but he knows that others also wish to call upon the name of the Lord, so they're united in prayer. And he also wisely posts a guard to protect the city and the citizens and the project. Verse 10. "Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, 'The strength of the labourers are giving out, and there is much rubble, and we cannot rebuild the wall.'" So they've reached the halfway point, and they're experiencing some threatening opposition, and now the people are starting to feel tired. They're starting to feel overwhelmed. But most of the commentators agree that the term "the people of Judah," it's not implying that it was only the people from the tribe of Judah that were discouraged. The term "the people of Judah" is generally accepted as implying all the citizens, regardless of what the tribe they were, who at this time were in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was in Judea. So just as a point of interest, the New American Standard Bible implies that this verse about where it says, "The strength of the labourers are given out, and there is so much rubble that we we cannot rebuild these walls. The New American Standard Bible version that applies this verse is a song or a poem that the people may have sung while they were doing their work. But most other common versions don't use this style. They sort of don't, they just have it quoted sort of verbatim and directly. But it's just an interesting deviation from some of the translations. Verse 10, it says there's so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Some say there's so much rubbish. So the work of rebuilding the wall was not just construction, but it was clearing away and hauling away the rubbish. So the ruins of the walls, they had been lying waste for about 100 years and really had become a collecting point for all kinds of rubbish. So ruins very quickly accumulate rubbish and they become a dumping ground when people don't value that place anymore. So clearing away the rubbish had to be done. The destroyed parts of the wall and then had accumulated rubbish that had to be cleared away so that the walls could be rebuilt upon the foundations. And if they didn't do this, the walls wouldn't be able to stand. So perhaps in this, there might be a bit of a side tangent of self-application here, if we stretch it out a little bit. So in our Christian life, not much can be done can be built for God's glory unless the rubbish is swept and cleared away. So taking out the garbage can be difficult work, but it must be done. And sometimes we need to have a spiritual cleanup before we can progress in our relationship with God. So there's a few verses that support this idea. Psalm 51 verse 10, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Romans 12 verse 2 says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing and perfect will. Ephesians 4 verse 31 to 32 says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, brawling, slander, along with every form of malice. So get rid of that rubbish. Instead, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving one another, just as Christ has forgiven you. Verse 11, all our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we'll be right there among them, and we will kill them and put an end to their work. And when the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they are going to attack us. So the enemies of the Jews had spread some deceptive lies and threats to instill fear to stop this rebuilding project of the Jerusalem walls. And this constant, overwhelming threat caused the builders of Jerusalem to really fear for their lives. Verse 13, therefore I, so that's Nehemiah, stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall and the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, with their spears and their bows. And after I looked those things over, I stood up and said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, do not be afraid. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome and fights for your families, your sons, your daughters, your wives and your homes. So Nehemiah 4 verse 14 says, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord is great and awesome. So he put into the minds of the people the right perspective. The challenge was great for sure, but there was no reason to fear. He who was with them was greater than he that is in the world. We see that in John 4 verse 4. Verse 15, and when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. Verse 16, from that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows and armour. The officers posted themselves behind the walls of Judah, who had built the wall. Those who carried materials to do their work, in one hand they held a weapon, and in the other each of the builders wore his sword on the side that he worked. And the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. So each of the workers worked in shifts. They had a sword on one side and a trowel in their hand when they had to get the work done. So the kingdom of God is built both with sword and with trowel. The sword came against every spiritual force of wickedness in the high places, and the trowel was used to do the work of the building up of God's project. 19. Then I said to the nobles, the officials and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. And at the time we also said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night so that they can serve as guards by night and workers by day. So verse 21 says, like from daybreak until the stars appeared. So they had dedicated themselves for the work more, working hard from sunrise until dark, even spending the night out building the site and protecting the place from attack. And Nehemiah reminds them that even if they hear the sound of the trumpet when they attacked, he reminds them that God will fight for them. So even when they're going to get attacked, Nehemiah recalls that this is God's work and he will defend them. He encourages them with the strength and the truth of God's sovereign plans and all his surpassing power. He reminds them that God will fight for them. Nehemiah's command is, our God will fight for us. It was an expression of faith, and it was not a call for passivity. He then immediately followed with some practical instruction for the people to be prepared for battle, stating that they would rally when they would hear the trumpet. So Nehemiah's statement shows a balance of faith and action. He tells the people that God will fight for them, so that's the faith aspect, but they also must be prepared for battle themselves by keeping weapons ready and listening for the trumpet. So that's the action. So the action is mirroring their faith. It isn't sort of in addition to or to question their faith. It's really to support what they already believe, that God is going to fight for them. So verse 23, it says, neither I nor my brothers, nor the men, nor the guards with me took off their clothes. Each of them had a weapon, even when he went for water. So basically they kept their clothes on at all times because they didn't want to be caught unprepared. They were always ready to respond to the blast of the trumpet. And so while Nehemiah, he relied on God, he also armed the people who worked with one hand and held a weapon in the other. Nehemiah relied on God, and he also required that the people remain prepared for action by remaining in their clothes, and he also placed an armed guard and had a pre-prepared battle plan. So overall, Nehemiah, he wisely and he calmly trusted God in the midst of the storm, but he also had some concrete things that God wanted him to do to obtain victory. Nehemiah 100% trusted that God would defend them and prepared him and his men for victory. His actions didn't undermine his faith, but confirmed his faith that God was in control and God would bring victory. And so that's all I have for you from Nehemiah chapter 4 today. It's been a pleasure, again, spending time with you. I look forward to next time when we are covering Nehemiah chapter 5. Bye.